None of us remember the day that we were born. We enter this world in darkness, and then gradually, like the sunrise behind me, we become increasingly aware of the world around us. First, perhaps the face of our mother, the smile on our father's face, the sound of their voices calling our name. And then with time we become fully aware of the human condition. It must have been the same with the long evolutionary history of the human species over the past 3 million years. Of course, we know essentially nothing about humanity millions of years ago. But as of the past few thousand of years, it's clear that humanity had already begun to ask the profound questions of life. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? It's said that no one can look directly at the sun or at death. But for ancient peoples, death had to be confronted. It had to be looked at squarely in the face. They saw death as an enemy that threatened their love for their fellow human being. Death threatened to take from them everything. And it seemed reasonable to them that death could be conquered. I'm sitting here in the Sierra Nevada of Eastern California, and surrounding me are bristlecone pine trees, some of which are 4,000 or even 5,000 years of age. If a tree can live that long, why not a human being? The seed that's planted in the ground appeared to ancient peoples to die, as if in a grave, but then in spring burst forth with new life. Perhaps the same could be true of humans. Perhaps there could be a resurrection and immortal life. The seeds that germinated to make these bristlecone pine trees fell to the earth in the time of the ancient Egyptian civilization in what we call the Middle Kingdom. Let's use that ancient culture as a window to the past to see how they viewed the mystery of life and death. One cannot help but be intrigued by the beauty and the mystery of the art of ancient Egypt. To me, this highly symbolic art is among the most powerful images ever created by mankind. And I say this for 2 reasons. First, simply put, it has such a powerful impact on the human brain. And second, it is perhaps subconsciously communicating what is arguably the most powerful myth of all time. Some critics say that while the images have certain aesthetic value, they nevertheless display a morbid preoccupation with death. After all, practically everything from the pyramids to the art and text covering the walls of the tombs related to death and the afterlife. But I think the opposite is actually the case. It is precisely because the ancient Egyptians had such a love and value for life that they spent so much time focused on the problem of defeating death. And principally, their values were solidly focused on the concept of love conquering death. As regards the mysterious nature of the art, I think the mystery reflects the fact that these were symbols or parables of profound religious concepts, closely guarded in what are called mystery religions. The mystery religions of ancient times promised a secret path back to immortality. The path, though, was like a labyrinth, and those initiated into the religions typically swore a solemn oath never to disclose the secrets. But by sorting through ancient texts, we can piece together the basic concepts. The religion of ancient Egypt, first organized around 3000 BCE, can be boiled down into at least 4 basic principles. The first principle is that human life is mortal, and so symbolized perhaps by a piece of rope,
The Egyptians saw this as an individual human life, the beginning of life associated with joy and great hope, and the end of life associated, of course, with the despair of death. The second principle was that there was a realm quite separate from humans of the gods that enjoyed a perpetual renewal of life, and so symbolized perhaps by the circle that has no beginning or an end. Or as in the modern day world, we would turn this around into the infinity sign, which means the same thing. The third principle was that there was once a demigod, half human, half god, that suffered a death at the hand of his enemies. And then out of love and compassion, that mortal life was turned into immortal life through human agency, by reaching out into the realm of the immortal and bringing that to the individual human life. And so the ancient Egyptians symbolized this by the Shen ring, a symbol of immortality transfer, or when held on a staff, it became the Ankh, the Egyptian symbol for immortal life. The fourth principle was that the average human being could also potentially obtain immortal life. According to the Egyptian Book of the Dead, one path led to destruction, but the path that led to life involved leading a righteous life on this earth, but also in participating in the mystery ceremonies. Because one is what they eat, the participants in this ceremony literally ate the body of the demigod in the form of bread. This became for them an antidote to death, or an immortality medicine.
The Egyptian name for God was Neter. Neter is said to mean the active power which produces and creates things in regular recurrence, which bestows new life upon them and gives them back their youthful vigor. The unseen power of Neter for perpetual self-renewal could be seen, for instance, in the cycling of the sun. This perfect circle rose every morning in the east and died and was buried in the west every day. Then, by an invisible force of immortal renewal, or Neter, it always rose again. Living at the edge of the desert, the Egyptians could not help but notice the scarab beetle. It rolls a ball containing its eggs. In this respect, it was like the unseen force of Neter that moved the sun from its setting in the west to perpetually re-emerge in the east. And the presence of its eggs in the ball reminded them of eggs perpetually giving birth to new life. So the scarab became a symbol of Neter. Similarly, though perhaps a lesser light, they used the symbol of the waxing and the waning of the moon in its perpetual cycle. This likely led to the birth of what was to become the central religious myth in the ancient Egyptian mysteries, the story of Osiris. Osiris was a god-man and king, and he taught his people civilization, the art of cultivating grain, for instance. His face was commonly painted green, reflecting the power of Neter to cause life to come forth in springtime. An example of what was once a secret part of the Egyptian mysteries was apparently the story of the murder of Osiris. After failing in his attempt to bring charges against Osiris in court, and the court finding Osiris innocent, his jealous brother Set killed Osiris and dismembered him into 14 pieces and scattered the parts of his body throughout Egypt. Out of a passionate love for her husband, Isis flew over the countryside in a desperate search for his body. She found the parts of his body, wrapped them in linen, and then, through the help of the gods and her skillful magic, she accomplished his resurrection. Bas-reliefs such as this, though later desecrated by Christians, show both the retrieval of his body from the Nile, as well as the phases of the moon. The cyclic dismemberment of the moon over 14 days after 3 days in darkness, then its restoration in the lunar cycle is likely the rationale of the story. Osiris's resurrection led to him ascending into heaven to be the judge and king over the dead. Here, for instance, we see Osiris seated on his throne, with the dead coming before him. Their heart is to be weighed against a feather. If their heart is heavy from evil deeds, they will be destroyed by the crocodile. If lighter than a feather, Osiris will grant them eternal life in paradise. So the ancient Egyptians believed that if a god-man, like Osiris, could live a virtuous life and then be resurrected from the dead, perhaps they too could be granted eternal life. The final stage of the initiation ceremony into the Egyptian mysteries appeared to be a form of sympathetic magic. If Osiris was the power of immortal renewal, then he was the force behind the resurrection of grain from buried and dead seeds. We see this in images of grain rising from the body of Osiris, and in what are called Osiris beds. These were containers of soil in the shape of his body, with grain sprouting from them, buried in the tomb with the pharaohs. Apparently, as part of the mystery ceremony, the disciples first followed in the footsteps of Isis, lamenting as they searched for the pieces of Osiris's body. Then they observed his resurrection, and literally ate and drank the body of Osiris in the form of bread and drink, with the bread being fashioned in the form of the pieces of his body. They were thereby consuming his power of immortal renewal into their mortal selves, so that, like Osiris, they could be born again. Diodorus Siculus, an ancient historian of Egypt, tells us of the power of healing displayed by Isis, even in her ability to raise the dead. And he tells us that she had a remedy called an Athanasius pharmakon, which in Greek literally means an immortality medicine, which in the case when it was used for human consumption was probably the bread of Osiris. In the Book of the Dead we read, "Homage to thee, O my divine father Osiris. Thou hast thy being with thy members. Thou didst not decay. Thou didst not become corruption. My members shall have an everlasting existence. I shall not decay. I shall not see corruption. I shall have my being. I shall live. I shall live. I shall germinate. I shall germinate." And importantly, the transfer of Neter, the gift of perpetual self-renewal, was given to Osiris first, and then potentially to all the followers of the mystery, through the hand of Isis. She took that which was mortal, that which had a beginning and an end, and turned it into the Shen ring, or as sometimes depicted, the Ankh, the symbol of immortal life. The Ankh, when held in the hand, becomes the Shen ring. So, though communicated in symbols so as to keep the mystery a secret, we can nevertheless see the central aspect of the myth being a story of human love attempting to conquer death by transferring to our loved ones the power of perpetual renewal, or Neter. In the 4th century BC, the Greek Empire grew in power and dominance over much of the Mediterranean region, including Egypt. The widening use of the Greek language and its philosophical ideas, such as a focus on the individual instead of the state, and a desire for personal immortality, led to a very religious era and a tremendous surge in the popularity of the mysteries. Much of this was due to the military prowess of Alexander the Great. Alexander promoted a tolerance of differing faiths, and did not force any particular belief system on the countries he dominated. As a result, the beliefs of the Egyptians spread throughout the Greek Empire, spawning a host of mystery religions. It's not possible to relate the history of all of them here, but let's look closer at the mysteries of the Greeks themselves. Some 11 miles from the dominant city of Athens, these ideas, transplanted from Egypt, took root.
I'm sitting in an ancient temple of what was once one of the greatest religions of the ancient Greco-Roman era, the great mystery religions of Eleusis.
Centuries before the birth of Christ, the Greeks reformulated the Isis and Osiris myth. The resulting gods, perhaps even more than the classical gods we normally think of, like Zeus or Athena, were designed to play an enormous role in ancient Greece. And of course, given the fundamental role the countries played in shaping our modern world, these mysteries were correspondingly important as well. Roman emperors, Greek philosophers, both men and women, free men and slaves, were forever changed by what happened in this small province on the northern coast of the Mediterranean. The story begins with a mother named Demeter, goddess of grain, and her daughter Persephone. Persephone, also associated with vegetable life, was known as the giver of goodly crops. But as in Egypt, the story goes much deeper than just gods of the harvest. One day, so the story goes, Persephone was gathering wildflowers. Tragically, her great beauty didn't escape the notice of Hades, god of the underworld. With a nod from Zeus, Hades suddenly appeared and abducted Persephone to take her to the underworld and to be his bride. Demeter thereby suffered the greatest possible loss, and she set off in an attempt to rescue her loved one. Demeter, torch in hand, traveled the countryside for 9 days without eating or drinking in a desperate search for her daughter. In Eleusis, while resting, she befriended mortals who lived in the region. Her despair then turned to anger, and since her life was inextricably linked to plant life, her anger led to a failure of plant life to thrive. As a result, the crops failed. A famine ensued, and importantly, the deficit in the crops led to an outcome that no offerings were made to the gods. The world was plunged into the depths of winter, and resenting the lack of offerings, Zeus appealed to Demeter to relent, but she refused. Finally, a settlement was reached. For part of each year, Persephone was allowed to return to the surface of the earth and rejoin her mother. The joy of their reunion led to Demeter allowing the reemergence of life in springtime. Plants sprouted from the apparently dead ground. Animals were fertile again. Eggs hatched, and life was in full bloom. And life persisted during the summer when offerings were again made unto the gods, all the time up to autumn, when Persephone again had to return to the underworld, and life again disappeared from sight. To understand the mystery, it's important to note that Persephone was the grain, buried in the ground in the fall, re-emerging as germinating plant life in the spring. Her mother was the counterpart of Isis. But where is Osiris in the myth? Even in the depths of winter, one plant stays evergreen, and conspicuous on the evergreen tree is the pine cone carrying the seed of the tree, unaffected by the seasons. The pine cone was therefore a symbol of Osiris, or in Greek parlance, the god Dionysus. Here we see Dionysus with his pine cone staff, a youthful-appearing god, and unlike most of the gods, one to which most people could relate. He, like Osiris, was a god-man, having Zeus as his father and a mortal woman as his mother. He was often associated with the vine or the grapevine, or in particular with wine. It was thought that he could not only cause vines to suddenly grow where he stood, but that he was actually in the wine. He was the source of the euphoric feeling or enthusiasm, as the Greeks called it, that they felt after drinking wine. The word enthusiasm comes from the Greek words that literally mean God within. Like Osiris, Dionysus, though innocent, was brutally murdered by his enemies, in this case the Titans, and then he was resurrected in springtime. The site most commonly associated with that of his resurrection was here at Delphi, It's also the site of the famous oracle at Delphi. Here we can see the image of Dionysus as it once stood on the temple overlooking the visitors. Plutarch, a Greek historian and priest of the mysteries at Delphi, authored a work titled On Isis and Osiris, in which he affirmed that Osiris and Dionysus were in fact the same god, but with different names. As further evidence of the unity of Osiris and Dionysus, even Osiris carried the symbol of a staff crowned with a pine cone. So participants in the Greek mysteries were commonly seen carrying the same staff in their ceremonies. In this bas-relief discovered at Eleusis, we can see Demeter on the left and Persephone on the right, with Triptolemus, one of the mortals that Demeter befriended during her ordeal. She's teaching him the rites to be practiced at Eleusis, in particular, the symbol of the sheaves of wheat. Isocrates, writing in the 4th century BC, tells of how, after her wanderings looking for Persephone, Demeter gave the Athenians the two greatest gifts, the gift of grain and the gift of the mysteries, the former saving mankind from the beast, the latter imparting a hope for life beyond the grave. But the gift was only for the initiates, who alone were permitted to hear the secrets. For those that were found to be pure and healthy in heart and in hand, the ceremony began here at Kerameikos, the cemetery of Athens. Following this very path, called the Sacred Way, participants in the ceremony wound their way through the cemetery on the way to Eleusis. These ancient followers almost certainly gazed upon these very monuments, reminding them of the certainty of human mortality. At Kerameikos, I was touched by one tombstone in particular, from about 430 BC, showing a woman with a grandson on her knee. The inscription reads, "I hold here the beloved child of my daughter, which I held when we were alive and saw the light of the sun, and now dead, I hold him dead." After marching 11 miles at night under the stars, reenacting the torchlight search of Demeter, they finally approached the temple in Eleusis and the Telesterion, also known as the Hall of Initiation. This is where the highest grade and the most holy ceremony took place, the real basis of their hope in immortality. We know it involved baptism and a reenactment of the search for Persephone, a poignant reflection on the joy and loss experienced with living life in the face of inevitable death. An early Christian named Hippolytus of Rome, speaking sarcastically of the ceremony, said, "The Athenians, while initiating people into the Eleusinian rites, likewise display to those who are being admitted to the highest grade at these mysteries the mighty and marvelous, the most perfect secrets suitable for one initiated into the highest mystic truths, an ear of grain in silence reaped." In attempting to discredit the mystery, he nevertheless likely revealed part of the secret. It's believed that after acting out the tragedy and associating the abduction of Persephone with reaping the grain from a sheaf of wheat, the high priest suddenly emerged from the Holy of Holies, the Anakteron, in a blaze of light, described as holy night, clearer than the light of the sun, bringing to the participants a gift from Demeter, perhaps within a wooden statue of the goddess. A holy bread made from a sacred field of wheat was given them to eat, and thereby, like Persephone, they too could rise from the underworld. You see, Persephone was the grain. Her descent was symbolic of human burial, and her reemergence symbolic of the participants' resurrection. Like the Assyrian mysteries, the priests of Eleusis likely taught the doctrine of palingenesis, the doctrine of being born again. The life of the gods is immortal, both that of Demeter and Dionysus. The Greek word for this type of immortal life is zoe. From this word we get, for instance, the word zoology. Persephone, being abducted by Hades, reminds us that our loved ones are ultimately taken from us and placed in the grave. Humans are mortal. The Greek word for mortal life was bios, from which we get the word, for instance, biography, the story of an individual life that passes away. Now, Demeter, out of joy for the return of her daughter, shared with mankind a mystic ceremony in which grain, and perhaps the wine of Dionysus, was consumed as a pharmakon athanasius, or a drug of immortality, to transmute the immortal essence of the gods into humans with the promise of resurrected life. But aside from a few clues here and there as to what actually occurred in this once great religion, we are largely left to speculate. But it's clear that the ceremony had an enormous emotional impact on the participants. As the Roman philosopher Cicero said, "Nothing is higher than these mysteries. They have not only shown us the grand principles of life and gain, not only a way to live joyfully, but they've also taught us how to die with good hope." The Roman Emperor Constantine converted Rome to Christianity early in the 4th century A.D. Then the Christian Emperor Theodosius, in 392, ordered the destruction of what came to be called the pagan temples. As a result, the great shrine at Eleusis became a ruin in 396 A.D., and the stone seats are now empty. This is lamentable because a better understanding of the mysteries would have helped us understand some of the most ancient of all conceptions of the problem of life and death. Christianity, of course, arose in Israel, a country at one point dominated by the Greeks and later by the Romans. And so people living in Palestine in the 1st century were very much exposed to the principles of the mystery religions.
If the rising sun is a symbol of new birth, then we're in the epicenter of symbolism here on the eastern wall of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. And so these graves are placed here in the hope of the resurrection of the dead. It's ironic that this is the birthplace of the symbolism of the hope of resurrection and immortality. Jesus, coming from a culture of religious belief that initially denied the idea of a resurrection of the dead, the concept of the resurrection not being present in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch or the Torah, became the very symbolism of the hope of immortality. Jesus saying in the Gospel of John, "I am the resurrection and the life." The word life in the Greek New Testament being zoe, the word for the immortal renewal of life.
While similar in many respects to the mysteries, Christianity claimed that a real historic person, Jesus, was the true God-man, suffering and dying at the hands of his enemies and rising from the dead after 3 days. The Gospel of Mark has an incredibly sparse account of the resurrection, basically saying that the tomb was found empty, and a young man told the women that came to the tomb that Jesus had resurrected from the dead. In contrast, the last account to be written, the Gospel according to John, thought to be written some 70 years after the fact, gives a far more detailed account and speaks of Jesus as being the Zoe, the way, and the truth, concepts quite foreign to the Jew. This is significant because by this time, Christianity had largely migrated into what is modern-day Turkey, Greece, and Italy. For instance, the concepts of a God-man leading his followers in the way, the truth, and the life is seen in a form of Dionysian religion called the Orphics in the 5th century BC. Here we see a scrap of bone with the words bios, meaning life, thanatos, meaning death, and bios again, indicating the concept of resurrection, with the word aletheia beneath, signifying that it was the truth that raised people from the dead. Again, in John, we read of Jesus saying, "Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit." Of course, the concept that the grain died when it was buried in the ground was incorrect. It's very clear that in the first century, the Christians justified the concept of resurrection by borrowing from mysteries. Besides this evidence from Jesus himself, we have the following statement from the Apostle Paul. "But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body will they come? How foolish! What you sow does not come to life unless it dies." And Paul mentions in his letter to the Philippians that he has a fellow laborer in the gospel whose name is written in the book of life, a certain Clement, who resided in Rome. Clement, who apparently knew and was a disciple of Paul, later became a successor after Peter in Rome. Clement's church in Rome survives to this day. Clement, in one of the earliest Christian letters surviving after those published in the Bible, says, "Let us consider how the Lord continually proves to us that there should be a future resurrection. Day and night declare to us a resurrection. The night sinks to sleep, and the day arises. The day departs, and the night comes on. Let us behold the fruits, how the sowing of grain takes place. The sower goes forth and casts it into the ground, and the seed being thus scattered, though dry and naked when it fell upon the earth, is gradually dissolved. Then out of its dissolution the mighty power of the providence of the Lord raises it up again, and from one seed many arise and bring forth fruit." But Clement gives no credit to the mystery foundation of these beliefs. In fact, his church was literally built upon the foundation of a mystery temple devoted to Mithra. Visitors can see this temple and the image of Mithra standing atop a pine cone. The early defender of the Christian faith, Justin Martyr, said of the Mithraic mysteries, "which the wicked devils have imitated in the mysteries of Mithras, commanding the same thing to be done. For that bread and a cup of water are placed with certain incantations in the mystic rites of one who is being initiated, you can either know or can learn." And so it seems logical to believe that the concept of communion, or the Eucharist, where the followers believed they were taking divinity and immortality into their bodies, was derived from the ancient mysteries. As we read in the writings of Ignatius, born around 30 AD, a disciple of the Apostle John, "Come together in common and break one bread, which is the medicine of immortality and the antidote against death, enabling us to live forever in Jesus Christ." Notice that Ignatius uses the very same terminology to refer to immortality transfer, Athanasius Pharmakon, that was applied to the power of Isis and Osiris offered through their communion ceremony. The official endorsement of Christianity in Rome under Constantine led to its establishment as an organized religion. The Roman Catholic Church seemed to take a particular pride in attaining a supremacy and a dominance over the mysteries. The Church labeled them pagan religions, and like many religions when in power, they used that power to destroy all competing belief systems. Here, for instance, we see outside the Vatican a symbol of ancient Egypt with a cross perched on the top, as if to say, Christianity wins. And if that were not clear enough, within the Vatican we find this painting of a temple of the mysteries with the mystery deity smashed to the floor and the crucifix taking its place. But a comparison of the original Christian doctrine as taught in the first Gospel of Mark compared to that of later Gospels like John and the letters of Paul and later developments under Constantine make it clear that Christianity at once denounced the mysteries as pagan and then simultaneously incorporated their symbolism. We see, for instance, the pine cone staff still carried by the Pope in modern times, though again capped with the Christian crucifix. The pine cone sculpture is still prominent on the Vatican grounds, and we see these symbols carried over into ceremonies such as the celebration of Easter. In the ancient temple of Eleusis, the blaze of fire and light that coincided with the high priest emerging from the Enactaron symbolized the return of Persephone from the underworld, and the hope of light and life after darkness and death. In the same way, the modern-day Christians celebrate a similar holy fire. Before every Easter in many Catholic churches, a nightly vigil is held, such as this one in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, said to be situated on the site of Jesus' resurrection. In an intensely emotional event, believers claim that in the hours prior to sunrise, a holy fire appears in proximity to the tomb each year. As evidence of its supernatural origin, they claim that it will burn without harming the true believer. And the evergreen is still celebrated in December, though Christians seem rarely to ask what these have to do with Christianity. And coming forward in time to the present day, we find mankind still blindly walking the labyrinth, not quite knowing why it is there or where they are going. People are still troubled by the inevitable fact of human mortality, trusting that the version of the mysteries handed down through the centuries in the form of current religions like Christianity provide the same hope sought for by the followers of the ancient mysteries. What we believe about the meaning of life is strongly influenced by the faith of the family in which we were born, and our family's faith by the religion of our ancestors, and ultimately to the beliefs of those that lived long before us in ancient and prehistoric times. A common thread to many of the belief systems of the Western world is the recognition of the problem of human mortality and a hope that one day death will be vanquished. Mankind founded this hope on the observation of various forms of perpetual renewal, such as that seen in the cycles of the sun and the moon and the reappearance of life in springtime. The desire to find this path back to immortality for the sake of our fellow human being is the noblest trait of mankind. It is what distinguishes us from all other animals. It is what we are. As the humanist Robert Ingersoll said, the idea of immortality, that like a sea has ebbed and flowed in the human heart, with its countless waves of hope and fear, beating against the shores and rocks of time and fate, was not born of any book, nor of any creed, nor of any religion. It was born of human affection, and it will continue to ebb and flow beneath the mists and clouds of doubt and darkness, as long as love kisses the lips of death.